let's talk a little bit more about Ancestry. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, you know who I am. So this is a response to a response video by Joel Sutherland, that is KnightSquire channel, obviously link below. And first up I have to say, fantastic video, particularly the opening sequence made me LOL a lot. Also, Joel, I do watch your channel. I definitely know who you are because we're friends on Facebook. So I absolutely know who you are. And yeah, you're doing nice work. And obviously I'd recommend anyone watching my channel to watch Joel's videos, again linked below. And I wanted to talk a bit more about Ancestry because I'm sure that any of my regular viewers will have seen my recent video talking about the adverts by Ancestry.com featuring Alex the Viking. Again, link to that video below.
Hello, my name is Alex. I thought I was half Polish, half Caribbean. This is the moment my Ancestry DNA revealed I'm actually a Viking.
I was quite facetious and maybe a little bit mean. Alex was obviously really excited about finding out that he had some ancestry that he just didn't even suspect or know about. And I completely understand that, actually. And I have very mixed personal history and opinions of the whole subject of ancestry. First of all, I have to explain my background. So I am almost entirely English, as far as I know, and I'll come back to why I know that in a minute. And I'm 1/8 Scottish and 1/16 German, Hessian to be precise. And the Scottish part is from the west side of Scotland. And the reason I know that is that my dad, my father, as a younger person took a huge, and still does have, he took a huge interest in family history research, kind of before it was popular. So these days it's massively fashionable. I don't know if fashionable is the right word, but anyway, it's a massively popular topic. There's television programs about it, things like Who Do You Think You Are? And obviously the explosion of people's understanding of DNA, you know, really while I was at university 20 years ago, it was something that was really starting then, and it has just got, you know, even scientists' understanding of how to harvest information, because they're building up the databases based on all of the genetic information that Ancestry.com use. And when I was at university, they were just really starting to look at Y chromosome mapping as in looking at it on a map, where Y chromosome groups were clustered. And that was fairly crude, really. And then probably about 5 years on from that, they started looking more deeply into the mitochondrial DNA, in other words, the maternal side. And these days, they're looking at all sorts of different aspects of a person's DNA to pin down with probabilities, and that's an important thing to note, it's not with certainty, but with probabilities of where their ancestors came from a very long time ago. And that's a point that I think a lot of people miss. A lot of genetic information that these websites like Ancestry.com and other businesses provide are providing information that relates to a really long time ago. And actually, if someone thinks that they're, like Alex the Viking, if someone thinks that they're part Polish, part Caribbean, they probably are part Polish, part Caribbean. And that was really the point I was trying to make the main point I was trying to make in my video, as well as pointing out that Viking isn't a genetic group. But if, for example, my mother was Polish and my father was from the Caribbean, say Jamaica, then I can say with a pretty much certainty that I'm 50% Caribbean and 50% Polish. And yes, in fact, it might be that if you go down the Polish line, you might find that I have Scandinavian ancestors, or it might be if you go down the Caribbean line, I have Scandinavian ancestors. But it all becomes a numbers game. And I think that's what people miss, and they don't necessarily realise the numbers that are involved. And so I was doing a bit of, as I mentioned, my father has done a lot of family history stuff. And he's looked down most lines of our family, and to be completely honest, most of it is relatively boring. It's English, middle class and working class. I have no aristocracy anywhere in my family as far as I'm aware. I have a few people who were quite successful socially, but what does that say about me? Nothing at all. And I'll come back to what does it say about me a bit later in this video, because I think that's one of the key topics actually, is that people are looking for an answer about themselves. And I completely agree with Joel in Joel's video that actually what your ancestors did might somehow affect the type of person you are, whether you're tall or short, fat or thin, what colour your skin is, this kind of things. But and it could even dictate certain aspects of your character. You know, we know that certain genetic groups have a predisposition towards liking caffeine or sugar or alcohol or whatever, or being better at certain activities, mental or physical. But putting all of that aside, a person fundamentally is a new person, and whatever your ancestors did before, good or bad, you're kind of starting from a clean slate. You might inherit some advantages and some disadvantages from the past, but you're your own person. Anyway, I'll come back to that point. But the numbers. So I was looking at bits of my family tree that my dad hadn't looked down. And I found some really interesting stuff, interesting to me anyway, and interesting historically, but there was also some stuff in there that made me uncomfortable. And I'm sure lots of people in America who look down their family trees find a similar thing, but I found that part of my family, we're going back to the 17th century here, but part of my family in the 17th century had owned plantations in the Caribbean. And that made me slightly uncomfortable, because obviously that means they were dealing in slavery. But, lots of different families, lots of people in the world, certainly in Europe, and lots of people in Africa, let's be frank about it, have ancestors who were involved with the slave trade. Equally, lots of German people will have relatively recent ancestors who were card-carrying Nazis. Lots of modern Japanese people will have ancestors who probably did some nasty things in the Second World War, either to enemies, basically, to the Chinese or the Europeans or whoever they considered enemies at the time. And that's basically true of almost any nation and any people we look at, with a few exceptions, maybe like Inuit people or something. But basically anyone, certainly anyone in the Western world, and really anyone in Asia, a lot of people in Africa, are gonna descend from a whole different group, whole different types, cross-section of people who did all sorts of different things. Some of them would have been very humble farmers, some of them would have been rich through hard work or through nefarious means. We all have a huge number of ancestors, and I just started working on some numbers. So to take one example, my great-great-grandfather was the chief of Glasgow Police. He was the chief constable of the police in Glasgow, and he essentially established the modern police force in Glasgow. And that's quite interesting to me, because it's a period of history, the mid to late Victorian period, which you guys will know I'm fairly interested in that period. And I've got photos of him and transcripts of him being involved in court cases and newspaper articles about him and all this kind of stuff. So it's interesting, because as a historian, there's stuff I can read about him. I've got ancestors who were, builders, and I've got nothing about them, because they were just working class people. So there's nothing written about them. I've got basically their name, who they married, what their children's names were, when they were born and when they were died. And that's it. And unfortunately, the vast majority of ancestors are like that. Some people don't even have that much for their ancestors. They might only have a name, they might not even have a name. So when someone has been successful in a historical period, it's useful because it gives us more to read about them. And if you're interested, then there's more material there. But just looking at the numbers, so taking my great-great-grandfather, he was called Alexander McCall, and he was from Newton-upon-Ayr, and he ended up obviously living in Glasgow. His brother was James McCall, who established the Royal Veterinary College in Glasgow, or Glasgow, if you're from Glasgow. I think they say it like that. Alexander McCall was born in 1830. Okay, so he was my great-great-grandfather, and I was born in 1976. So he was born 146 years before me, and he was my great-great-grandfather. And because he was my great-great-grandfather, that's 4 generations. If we take 146 years and divide it by 4, then you get 36 years per generation. If any of my maths is wrong here, I apologise, but it's all roughly correct, I think. But the important thing to note is that I might go, oh, my great-great-grandfather was Alexander McCall, Chief Constable Alexander McCall. But in that generation, there are 16 people that I descend from, okay? Because I have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and 16 great-great-grandparents. It just doubles each time. It's a fairly simple equation. Now, the maths I'm going to use here assumes that there's no cross-breeding, inbreeding in my family. Now, in reality, we know that actually all populations have a degree of inbreeding in them. It's particularly true in certain social groups. If you go to a country where the population's smaller, usually there's going to be more inbreeding. If you look at a certain social group that don't very often breed out of their circle, the aristocracy, for example, famously inbred, but you know, royalty, really the extreme, where royals only married into other royal families, a very high degree of interbreeding. So, you know, Queen Victoria's offspring and their progeny and how they're interrelated is quite interesting. But similarly, you know, some religious or cultural groups, Jewish people, for example, most Jewish people for most of history have only intermarried with other Jewish people. So there's a higher degree of essentially inbreeding in Jewish people. But you could say it of Swedish people as well. You know, Sweden is a small country with small population. I think it's about 8 million, which is the same population as London. But if you go to Norway, I think Norway's about 4 million, if I remember correctly, 4 or 5 million, or Scotland indeed, I think it's about 4 or 5 million. Then if we assume that they only bred within their groups, which we know they didn't, because we know that there were people moving in, moving out to some degree, in some countries more than others. But if you assume they just bred with each other, there's going to be a degree of inbreeding and cross. But for these numbers, let's assume that none of my ancestors were related to each other. Okay, so that means that after 4 generations, that's my great-great-grandfather, I had 16 ancestors. So say, for example, one of my great-great-grandfathers or grandmothers had been a massively evil person. At the end of the day, that's only a 16th of me, and it doesn't reflect on me really. They may have made really bad life choices, or they may have been a hugely successful person. That equally doesn't really represent very much of me. It's only a 16th of me, and that's only a great-great-grandparent. That's only 4 generations. If we go 5 generations, it goes to 32 ancestors. It magnifies very, very quickly. Obviously, it doubles. 6 generations, 64 people. Now, it goes on and on like this, but if, for example, we go back 10 generations, now, how far back are we talking about for 10 generations? Well, I've taken 30 years to be a generation. Now, the problem with working out how long is a generation is we have to accept people breed at different times. Some people continue having children right the way through their lives for as long as they're able to. Some people start very young, some people start very late, but I've taken 30 years to be a generation. So after 10 generations, that's 300 years ago. So we're in the year 2017, so we're going back to 1717, okay? So the early 18th century, the time of small swords and all of this kind of stuff. I have to bring swords into it, of course. So 300 years ago, 10 generations ago, I had 1,024 ancestors. That's a lot of people. If you just imagine a hall or a space full of 1,024 people, just the people in that generation, that's not counting all of the people that come down from that as well. So I had, in the year 1717, approximately 1,000 ancestors. So really, you know, when I go back and do a bit of research and find that in the year 1717, one of my ancestors owned slaves and maybe did some really nasty things, that's one person out of 1,000. The other, 1,024. The other 1,023 people may have been, you know, philanthropists. They may have been farmers. They could have been fishermen. Obviously, in reality, they're a cross-section of society. In the year 1717, I had probably over 1,000 ancestors, and that's the same for any of you out there. And it really makes you realise the insignificance, actually, of ancestry, because when someone says, "Oh, you know, they look at their DNA, for example, and they say, "Oh, I'm part African, or I'm part Viking, I'm part Scandinavian, or I'm part French, or part Native American." Potentially, that could be a percentage of their ancestors, or it could only be one. If we looked at Y chromosomes, for example, it could just be one person, because that just comes down through the male line. And really, if we're looking at what we're made of the sum of our ancestry, genetically at least. And yeah, like I say, 300 years. To take it back even further, if we take it back 600 years, so now we're taking it back to the time just after the Battle of Agincourt, 600 years ago today, England was at war with France in the year 1417. Henry V was alive, well on course to becoming the joint King of France and King of England. He was still alive, hadn't died yet, and you know, England was basking in the glory of its victories in France, and it was the Middle Ages. It was the late medieval period. You know, knights were wearing full plate armour, and English longbowmen were at the sort of height of their potency, and all around the world different things were happening. Obviously, very interesting period of history wherever you look in the world, whether it's Japan, or even if we look at, you know, Middle America, kind of the Aztecs and such like. Anyway, 600 years ago, if we take it to be 30 years per generation, that's 20 generations. Assuming none of them were interrelated, which obviously they probably were, but if we assume that none of my ancestors were interrelated, I would have 1,048,576 ancestors in that year, just in 1417. That's insane. Over 1 million ancestors. Can you even imagine? So there's some numbers to mull over, and I think the numbers for me give the context. I know it's my favourite word, but think about those numbers and bear in mind what I'm going to say next, which is really my summing up. First of all, when we look at our ancestry and look for good and bad people in a modern kind of subjective way, remember that the further back you go, you're talking about huge numbers of people. Obviously, your parents, there's 2 of them, your grandparents, there's 4 of them, your great-grandparents, there's 8 of them, your great-great-grandparents, there's 16 of them, and it goes like that. 300 years ago, you had roughly around 1,000 ancestors alive at that moment. 600 years ago, you had over 1 million ancestors alive at that moment, assuming they weren't interrelated, which they probably were, and we're all interbred to some degree. Really, what individuals, or even small groups, even families within your ancestry did or were, whether they were good, bad, rich, poor, creative, destructive, you know, it doesn't reflect that much on you, even genetically. But certainly in terms of kind of virtues or qualities, it doesn't reflect on you. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for from ancestry, is a sense of what they should measure up to based on what they think they're made of. And my strong belief is, you know, you are unique. There's never going to be a person who's exactly like you. you write your own history. You can do whatever you are physically capable of doing. Not saying that everyone's equal. Some people are cleverer, some people are stronger, some people are healthier. But you have maximum capacity for you, and you can live up to that in whatever way you want to. And whatever your ancestry is, or the history of your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and all the way back, doesn't need to reflect on the person that you are. In terms of identity, I think a lot of people are looking for identity because they feel disconnected from their ancestry. They feel a need to be rooted. I think this is especially the case in what have been colonial countries like America, Canada, Australia, and I think there's a need for certain people to feel rooted in a culture or in a historical past. But again, I would remind you that 600 years ago, you had 1 million ancestors. So of those 1 million people, they could be from anywhere. You might have ancestors from Japan or Africa or America or Europe. You just don't know. And whilst we can get some indicators and some percentages from these genetic tests like on Ancestry.com, at the end of the day, we are all interrelated to varying degrees, and our ancestors came from a very large spread all over the world and came from many, many places to the point where you are now. So really, your identity is what you make of it. You can identify with whichever part you choose, really. And even parts, you can identify with parts that you don't know about. If you're, say you're an English person, or Raffaello or Metatron, if you say Metatron is really into Japanese culture, so, some people might go, Raffaello, you're Italian, why you like Japanese things? And he'd go, because I like katanas and I like samurai armor and I like the language and the culture and the art, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. For all we know, Raffaello could have Japanese ancestry, and whether he does or whether he doesn't, it doesn't matter, okay? Because we all come from lots of different places, and we're all interbred and we're all intermingled. And lastly, I want to finish by saying I do understand why people want to know these things. It's a human instinct to want to feel part of a group, part of a tribe. We are a tribal species. We've survived against all odds, against nature, against animals, against enemy humans, by being tribal. And it's completely natural. We've been naturally selected to be like that. The loners, the people who went out there and didn't band together, for the most part, probably didn't survive. So I completely understand it, but equally people like me and like most of you who are watching this channel who are interested in history, historical curiosity is completely normal, and I completely understand it. So I want to finish up by saying, whilst I do think that to a certain degree ancestry means nothing, I am nevertheless personally interested in it, and I am interested in family history, but I just remind you to keep in mind those numbers and actually not don't overestimate how important some things you might find out about your ancestry are, because in the grand scheme of things, they're interesting and they're nice to know, but they're not individually important. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.